Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining our webinar. We will give it a couple minutes to have people join, but in the meantime, if you want to throw in the chat where you are joining us from, we would love to see where you are. All right, I'm starting to see that participant numbers start to slow down, so we will jump right in. But again, thank you for joining the Concussion Legacy Foundation for our second webinar in this year's International CTE Awareness Month series. I'm Dr. Samantha Bureau, the Director of International Programs here at CLF. Our global efforts to promote safer sports and work towards a future without CTE are made possible by groundbreaking research from members of the CLF Global Brain Bank. And as a scientist myself, it is truly an honor to work alongside these world-renowned researchers, uncovering so much about the long-term consequences of brain trauma, specifically in military veterans and athletes who've played contact or collision sports. So in today's webinar, our panel will discuss some of the exciting breakthroughs in CTE research. We are moving closer to diagnosing this degenerative brain disease during life and eventually hopefully designing clinical trials focused on potential treatments specific to CTE. Later, we will discuss the urgency of boosting research efforts focusing on brain injury and trauma in military communities, so stay tuned for that. Again, this is the second installment of our International CTE Awareness Month webinar series. So last week, we had 4 guests from 4 different countries join me to share their perspectives and experiences with CTE. You can watch that webinar on demand on the CLF YouTube channel if you scan the QR code here on your right. And then next week, our third CTE Awareness Month webinar will focus specifically on women affected by this neurodegenerative disease. You can scan the QR code on your left to register now and for this important conversation, and we'll also put the link in the chat so you can see that. Speaking of signing up, we also encourage everyone watching this webinar to join the CLF Research Registry. Again, you do not need to have a history of exposure to head impacts or contact or collision sports to join. Many of our studies that we are helping recruit for also require controls. So basically individuals to compare against those who've had extensive history of impact. So whether you have a history of contact or collision sports or would like to serve as a control, we do encourage you to sign up and share this with your friends who may also be interested. You can visit concussionfoundation.org/research to learn more about clinical research, brain donation, and then some of the ongoing recruiting efforts for upcoming studies. As you'll hear today from our experts, CTE research has come a really long way in a very short period of time. Year after year, international research unlocks new insights into how repetitive trauma can lead to a variety of issues later in life. And the more we've learned about what causes CTE, the more we can understand how to prevent it and how to treat and cure it. If you are worried about suspected CTE, there are ways to manage and treat symptoms. The CLF helpline is here for you and your family. I would really encourage you to reach out to us. And again, no matter where you live, so if you're joining us from the US or other countries, we are here for you. Our dedicated team can connect you with vetted providers who know what you're going through. And these incredible resources are free thanks to the generosity of CLF supporters. Another great way to support the CLF helpline and our CTE prevention efforts is to join the Race to End CTE, which will relaunch later this month. This team-based fundraising competition encourages supporters to share education about the disease with their families, communities, workplaces, and alumni networks, inspiring them to join the fight with the message that together we can end CTE. For today's discussion about the state of CTE research, we will welcome CLF co-founder and CEO, Dr. Chris Nowinski, alongside Dr. Mike Alosco, the co-director of clinical research at the Boston University CTE Center. And then finally, we are very pleased to have CLF Director of Development and Military Programs, Charlie Bailey, who will join us to discuss the need to reach those affected by brain trauma in training and combat and our efforts to expand research among veterans with this type of exposure. So there is quite a lot to cover in any conversation about CTE research. So let's just jump in and get started. With that, I'd like to welcome Dr. Chris Nowinski for a few short words before Dr. Alosco joins the discussion. Take it away, Chris.
Thank you, Dr. Bureau. Thanks to everyone who's made the time to join us here this afternoon in the middle of International CTE Awareness Month. It's great to see so many familiar faces and names in the chat too. So thanks, guys, for joining. I'm very proud of the fact that we've made this a global discussion about CTE. In the US, Canada, Brazil, the UK, Australia, New Zealand, leading researchers have opened the world's eyes not only to this disease, but the nature of how it develops. Through this research, we now know definitively that CTE is preventable and that CTE is a choice. This is the foundation of CLF advocacy programs like Stop Hitting Kids in the Head, which has informed policy changes worldwide aimed at protecting our youngest athletes from CTE. And Dr. Bureau covered many of these efforts in last week's webinar. Now, from the very beginning, which was only about 16 years ago, experts at Boston University have been at the forefront of CTE research. So it's my great honor. It was my great honor to co-found the Unite Brain Bank at the BU CTE Center back in 2008. And it's now the world's foremost research repository dedicated specifically to CTE. And when I say foremost research repository, we're closing in on 1,500 brains donated and closing in about 1,000 of them that have had CTE. And that's probably more than 5 times the world's experience, the rest of the world combined. And so a lot of the things that we're discovering can only be discovered through this really dedicated research team at Boston University and their colleagues now around the world. And it's really thanks to all our legacy donor families who have donated the brain of a loved one to help us learn all this information. I know many of you who are here today. So the work taking place in Boston is really groundbreaking, and that's why we're all here. And so I'd like to welcome the co-director of clinical research at the BU CTE Center, Dr. Michael Alosco. He's an associate professor of neurology at BU School of Medicine. He's the director of neuropsychology at the BU and Boston Medical Campus Memory and Aging Clinic, which we refer a lot of patients to, as well as the director of the BU Alzheimer's Disease Research Center Clinical Core. But he's really a leader on the team at the forefront of research into the long-term effects of repetitive head impacts, what they look like clinically, and he's here to talk about the next frontiers of CT research. So I've prepared a couple of questions today. You know, I talk to Mike multiple times a week, but we're really here to answer your questions as well. So I'll start setting the table, but please use the Q&A tab here on Zoom, and we'll get to as many questions as we can. So Mike, you ready to roll?
I'm ready.
All right. Well, welcome, Dr. Alosco. So right now we can't diagnose CTE in living with a known accuracy level. Everyone knows that. And I know you're working so hard to change that. So I would love to hear about some of the things that you are doing to help change that. And I would love to hear a little bit about the study published last week that was really groundbreaking, tying the disease to clinical symptoms.
Yeah, thanks. And thanks for having me here to you and the whole CLF team. I think it goes without saying that our partnership on this front to be able to accurately diagnose CT is really important. So let me first provide somewhat of a framework on how we're going about this, because I think it's really important to establish that we are quite good at diagnosing Alzheimer's disease during life. And so we have that framework to work from. So if I share my screen if I share my screen here, this is the framework that we're taking for CT. We're combining a clinical interview and history with biomarkers, and we think that's what's going to get us to the best way to diagnose CT during life. And so what exactly do I mean by that? So when we think about Alzheimer's disease and other forms of dementias, which include CTE, we first start off by just characterizing what are the signs and symptoms? What does the person look like in front of us? And that's our first step in the diagnostic process, right? And if you see here, the first thing we do is, does this person have normal cognition, normal mood and behavior? Does this person have impairment in thinking and memory? Does this person have dementia? So now there's someone who has impairment in thinking and memory, and now they need help with functioning in their everyday life. So this is the first step we do in a diagnosis, just taking the signs and symptoms and characterizing the person in front of us. But we're moving now towards a world where we use biomarkers for the best way to diagnose these diseases during life. And this shift really happened in 2018, where in Alzheimer's disease and now CTE, we're trying to identify tools, things like imaging, where we can actually visualize these disease proteins in the brain. Right. So we've taken these steps and we're starting this process in CTE, and we've made a lot of progress. In fact, the first step here is, what are the signs and symptoms of CTE? What is the clinical presentation? We have this research criteria published in 2021 known as TES. And TES is what we view as the clinical syndrome of CTE. And at its core are two clinical features.
Hey, Mike,
Yeah.
let me interrupt you for 1 second.
Yeah.
These are great slides, but they're small on our screen as they are. Could you go up to slideshow and present them that way, please?
Yeah, sorry about that. Thank you. Better?
A little better, but if we could get rid of the next slide feature,
Right.
that would be great. Or we'll cut this out of the rebroadcast. I do love seeing the questions come in.
Yeah. So there we go. I have it now.
Thanks, Mike. Don't want to waste your beautiful slides on being too small.
What a great way to make the presenter nervous here. There we go. We all set now? Okay. Yeah. So kind of we have what we call the clinical syndrome of CTE, and at its core for CTE, there's impairment in thinking and memory, specifically in memory and executive function, and neurobehavioral dysregulation. And this is something we refer to as impulsivity, easily triggered or easily angered. And these symptoms are based on what we've learned from talking with families who their loved ones have had autopsy confirmed CTE. Now, getting back to your question of this new study we had. So there's really been a long debate in the field. Does this tau of CTE actually cause some of the symptoms that we've been describing and seeing? And this new study kind of addresses that exact question. So this was just published this month in February. And we took our brain bank, and this included 364 brain donors who had autopsy confirmed CTE. And the goal of this study was to look at how is the tau of CTE associated with the various symptoms that we have seen in this setting. So we looked at all different regions of the brain, as you can see here on the left, and then all different types of symptoms that we've have described in CTE, specifically here in cognitive function. What we found was really strong associations between overall tau burden, particularly in the front part of the brain or the frontal lobe, with all of these measures of cognitive and daily function. We also found some other associations with the temporal parts of the brain, as well as what we call the parietal, more back parts of the brain, and also some more of the middle parts of the brain. So really what this slide here shows you is a strong relationship between tau of CTE and some of these thinking and memory symptoms as reported by family in people with autopsy confirmed CTE. It gets a little bit more nuanced when we look at the neuropsychiatric symptoms, so that emotional regulation. Here, what we found was we did find association between tau in the front part of the brain and behavioral regulation or emotional regulation, but otherwise we did not find effects, and the effects were smaller here. So this still begs the question, okay, we see this relationship with cognitive symptoms, but we're still trying to gather a better understanding of what is exactly the cause of neuropsychiatric symptoms in this setting. But it provides really strong support for a lot of these symptoms we've been describing in TES, and really helps us move us forward in validating these criteria and hopefully getting them to the clinic one day. So I think I'll turn it back to you now, on Dr. Nowinski for next what we think is next to address.
Yeah, that's wonderful. And that study is really special because, you know, from my perspective, I know you wouldn't say that, but we've been fighting this battle for 15 years now where there are some critics at some organizations, usually associated with professional sports organizations, that have claimed that first it was, CT is not caused by repetitive head impacts, and I think we've now proven that definitively. And then the question is, well, even if it is caused by head impacts, there's no proof that the cells or the damage that you see is causing any symptoms whatsoever. And of course, we know that's not true from talking to the families, but it was really important to put the data behind it. And so this is the first of what will be multiple studies that I think are going to make it very clear to people that CTE is causing dementia just like Alzheimer's disease does. And we have a lot of work to do on that. So I guess the next question is, you talked about biomarkers sort of being the next generation. So we do understand the clinical symptom relationship. And so why don't we talk a little bit about what you think might work for biomarkers? I know you've got some studies that you're planning that we can't yet talk about because we aren't yet open for recruiting, but what areas do you think investigation are going to prove to be worthwhile?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And
actually, would you take off your sharing of your screen so people can see you better?
Yeah, sure.
Thank you.
It's a great question. So what we just covered now is, right, the signs and symptoms. What are the signs and symptoms of CTE? Someone comes in the door, they describe to you what they're going through, and we need to get more specific on what those are. But now we couple that with a biomarker, and if you're not familiar with a biomarker, you know what it is. If you have problems with your heart, you get an EKG. If you want to test your diabetes, you get a blood level. Same concept here, except we're talking about how well does the brain function. So what we've really been studying at our center, and I'm going to actually pull my screen back up, is tau PET imaging. So this is one example of what a tau PET scan is. So tau PET scan, you get something called a radio tracer injected into your arm. That tracer is designed to seek out certain proteins in the brain, stick to it, and then you can actually visualize it by taking pictures. So as you see here, so on the left is a CTE tau. Can we visualize that with a PET scan? Okay. And this is what I'll tell you. So this is just two studies we've done. Well, one's by our group, one's by our collaborators at UCSF. This is looking at a tracer called fortaucepir. I won't get into these studies in detail, but the bottom line here is that we do see some differences in people, a group of people who are at risk for CTE versus a group of controls. We do see some differences, but they're not huge differences. They're small effects. They're meaning this isn't going to be our diagnostic test. And what I think and we've done a lot of these studies on this tracer and other tracers, and overall as we're doing these studies, as we're learning, we're essentially taking things that work really well in Alzheimer's disease and trying to apply it to the setting. And I think that's useful, but I don't think that's going to get us to where we need to be in CTE. We need really kind of from the beginning discovery and developmental efforts on developing these things specifically for CTE. And that's the type of the things we need to go. Then we can apply it to our living participants and see how they work. But I'm not so convinced that what we have for Alzheimer's disease is going to work well for what we have in CTE.
You want to actually expand on that and talk about the way that the CT tau misfolding was only discovered in 2019 to be different than Alzheimer's disease? Yeah,
great. So when you think about CTE and Alzheimer's disease, they're both characterized by this misfolding of tau. Okay, so as you know, now the way that where the tau accumulates is different, but also the molecular nature of this tau is different. So the type, how it folds, where it folds is different in CTE versus Alzheimer's disease. And it's also different in other molecular ways as well. The density or how much of tau probably also makes a difference as well. For example, in CTE, we see the tau in the early stages, right, gather at the folds of the brain, bottom of the folds of the brain. That might be really hard to image on something like a tau PET scan. So I think the differences in tau are really meaningful when it comes to our biomarker efforts. And that's why I am excited. You mentioned some of one of the other studies we're working on. We're looking at blood-based biomarkers. And what's cool about the blood-based biomarkers is that you can look at different types of what we call tau epitopes. So, for example, it's just where the tau misfolds. So, like in Alzheimer's disease, p-tau 217 is really good for detecting Alzheimer's disease in the blood. We can look at a whole different types of phosphorylation sites and see which one is best for CTE. And so I'm really excited about looking at the blood to see if that can get us somewhere with diagnosing CTE in life.
Thanks. But you mind hopping off the screen? Stop sharing your screen here again. So, so I'll ask sort of one more question, and then I'll ask Dr. Bureau to come back to sort of coordinate some Q&A because some really good questions are coming in. But I guess what is your one of the questions that dovetails off what you just said is, how do you feel about the likelihood of diagnosing CTE living people by age? What's going to happen first and why? Is it older people, younger people, midlife?
Yeah, so I think, at this stage, diagnosing CTE in life accurately is challenging, but I think our confidence goes up in a couple of different scenarios. So first, if you have someone who is older, who has impairment in their thinking and memory based on the data I just showed you, and you rule out other causes like Alzheimer's disease, and this person has extensive exposure to repetitive head trauma, your certainty of what's going on definitely goes up there. When they're younger and younger, relative here, you might not expect Alzheimer's disease in that group. Sometimes they do or do not have cognitive impairment. There's often a lot of other things going on, and when there's a lot of other things going on, it becomes really challenging to make an accurate diagnosis and differentiate from others. So I think, to answer your question, I think there are age groups and scenarios where our comfort level is increasing. But we really need, this is a disease, as we've shown, that can affect a lot of different ages. So we need to get to a place where we're comfortable across all ages.
Right. And it's also probably worth mentioning that with the tau PET scans, the binding has a little bit to do with how much of the abnormal tau is there. And so there's more of it in older people. And so if a PET scan ends up working really well, it'll work well in older people first, but it probably won't work in the teens and 20s who just might have the beginnings of CT. And I guess it's worth mentioning one more thing. We've talked a lot ourselves in the last couple of weeks on the difference between symptoms that we think are caused by CT and symptoms that we might be caused by other aspects of traumatic brain injury, damage to the white matter, inflammation, things like that. So do you want to speak a little bit to how you look at people with early life symptoms? Maybe talk a little bit about the August study and the advice for people who are younger, who might be worried they have suspected CT because they have the exposure, about, when and how to seek help and how to think about what's going on with their symptoms.
Yeah. So let's take it from the angle of, so when I think about this, the symptoms here, we do have a pretty diverse group of symptoms. They're cognitive, mood, and behavior. Based on the data I've shown you, we do see strong relationships between the tau and cognitive symptoms. The mood and behavior symptoms we often see start young, and as also based on the data I showed you, they aren't always related to the tau. And what we have shown is that there's weaker effects there. And I think that there's other pathways by which some of those symptoms might manifest, perhaps from other types of things going on in the brain from repetitive head trauma, like injury to the white matter. But I also think that these are symptoms that could be manifest regardless of any type of pathology from repetitive head trauma. And I think the important message is that they can be treated, and that we have treatments for depression. We know how to deal with that. And I think that's what we focus on when people come to us with more of these mood behavior complaints is, I don't know if this is CTE. I don't know if this is related to other things for repetitive head trauma, but I do know we can do something about it. So let's really focus in on that.
Yeah. And I think it's worth mentioning that we had a lot of brains donated of younger people under 30 for this, that was published in August by Dr. Ann McKee as the lead author. And she noted, just under half had CTE, but they all had very similar symptoms. And so if you think about being in that perspective in your 20s or 30s with those symptoms that you think might be CTE, this study showed most of them weren't, and therefore they wouldn't have been progressive in the same sense. Like if you can get these under control, if you can get these treated properly, like there's no progression, there's no, I'm going to get dementia at 60 or 70. And so it's important to think of. All right, well, thanks, Mike. So now we're going to go to the audience here. So I'm going to ask Dr. Bureau to come back, our wonderful moderator, and good luck choosing between all these great questions.
It is going to be difficult. Really, really great insights that we've just heard. And I'm seeing some common themes here in the chat and in the Q&A. So I'll try and bucket some of these together. But I think, Mike, to start off, to set the tone, we had a question early on when you were presenting some slides about TES, like what is it? And what is that framework? I think that would be a good place for us to start.
Yeah, sure. So traumatic encephalopathy syndrome, or TES, is what we think is the clinical syndrome of CTE. So CTE is just a neuropathological diagnosis, right? Only detect it and diagnose it through a microscope of brain tissue. TES describes the clinical presentation of that pathology. And so what it boils down to is that it requires people to have exposure to repetitive head impacts, because that's the necessary risk factor for CTE. And then it requires a set of symptoms. And that's where we can characterize the clinical presentation of CTE. And that's what, and all these neurodegenerative diseases, Alzheimer's disease, frontal temporal dementia, they all have these clinical syndromes that we first diagnose, and then we use our biomarkers to kind of confirm the etiology or cause.
That's great. And building off of that, we are seeing, quite a few questions and different iterations around what people can really do now if they are experiencing symptoms. A couple of questions about, is it really just finding counselors and treatment providers that can handle the symptoms? What's the road looking like for disease modifying therapeutics? We're not there yet, but what does that maybe look like in the future? So if you could just give us maybe even just an overview of what you would do in your clinic when you see someone come in, and how you may approach someone who believes they may have suspected CTE.
Yeah, so we have a memory and aging clinic, and these types of clinics we have also, they exist throughout the country, and with CLF, or also happy to help connect you wherever you might be. But it boils down to coming in and doing a pretty extensive evaluation, and ultimately the question we're trying to answer, is there a progressive brain disease going on, right? So regardless of what type it is, that's the question we can answer. And we do that by doing doing an interview with the patient and the family. Having the family there is very important. They're there for the journey. They can be just as affected too as the patient. We collect a history. We do neuropsychological testing to determine whether or not there is impairment in thinking and memory. We do an MRI of the brain so we can look for shrinkage or atrophy in the brain. And then if indicated, we'll do other types of biomarkers like a PET scan, or like a lumbar puncture to look at the fluid to rule out Alzheimer's disease or other potential causes. And then and then we also do other blood work to rule out reversible causes of thinking and memory problems, things like vitamin B12 deficiency or trouble with the thyroid. And then so what the patient ends up leaving is a few things. So one is we come up with a clinical diagnosis. Does this person have cognitive impairment or dementia, or nothing? Or no kind of cognitive complaints? Or are there mood and behavioral problems? And then we can answer the question of, do we see evidence of a progressive brain disease? Is Alzheimer's disease present or not? And then we provide a lot of education about these topics and about CTE and where we are and where we are not with the science and being able to diagnose this in the living. And then we provide a set of recommendations. If they're local, we kind of follow through with them on a regular basis. But there's kind of really close relationship we form with the patients that come to us, and I think that's the type of care, it might be bias and model that's needed to get these people the help they need.
No, that's a really great overview. And, of course, your time as a researcher is very limited in the clinic, and not everyone can come see you. So I think, Chris, we are seeing some questions about what can people do today? How can they find these people? So if you would like to give a brief overview of the CLF helpline and how a resource like that or similar may be a good way to connect people with treatment plans, such as the one that Mike just walked us through.
Yeah, thank you. So yes, ever since I started doing this, I was getting, everyone who could get a hold of me would reach out when they had a friend or family member who was struggling with long-term concussion symptoms, suspected CT. And as that volume increased, we realized we needed to create a service for people. And so Sam leads that team, and there's now 4 full-time staff that are helping our intake of people who reach out, nearly 50 a week, asking, what doctor should I see? I have these symptoms. I'm struggling. It's designed to be like that service where you don't know where to go. You don't exactly know what's going on. You don't have a doctor helping you. And you don't have community or understanding of it. So if you're worried about this and you don't know what your next step is, do reach out, because we have Mike Burke and his team have over 7,000 medical providers resource list. So we can find you somebody who can probably treat your symptoms, who lives near you. And we even help you get in there if you need to. We have support groups online monthly. We have 5 or 6 different types now, for caregivers, for people that are suspected CT, long-term concussion symptoms. We have one-on-one peer support volunteers. So one of the more difficult things that people go through is that they don't have anyone to talk to, right? Who are you going to tell your problems to who might understand? So we rolled this out for people with post-concussion syndrome or persistent post-concussion symptoms. And now we're in the midst of figuring out a program for people with suspected CTE. So if you have that and you want someone to talk to, do reach out and let us know, and we should be rolling out this program here in the next couple of months. And then there's a lot of educational resources. The team's created some great guidebooks for caregivers and guidebooks for patients to understand what you're going through. Because this is a difficult thing to fight alone, and you're often the first person in your cohort of friends and family that are dealing with this. So please do reach out, clfhelpline.org, and we are here for you. I've already been working on 3 or 4 cases today of various people who've reached out.
Great. Thank you, Chris. Again, really, really great questions here in the chat. I do see a few people, really asking where do we go? Who do we see? I would strongly echo Chris's suggestion to reach out to the CLF helpline. Our team is phenomenal. They can help connect you to people near you. And I see some questions or comments about, how can this work be supported around the world? And, we do have CLF chapters around the world. We have helpline teams in those countries that can connect you to resources near you. Going back to some of these questions that are about, I guess, the timeline, Mike, for CT, we're seeing some questions about, how quickly do we see onset following exposure to concussion or repeated hits? What does that look like? Some questions about the role of inflammation and the need to rest. So could you just give us a breakdown? It is a progressive neurodegenerative disease. So what does that mean? And what may this look like when you think about when someone is sustaining this exposure to when they start seeing symptoms?
Yeah, I mean, some of these we're still trying to figure out the answers to these questions, but what we typically have seen and historically and even currently is there is often a delay of when the exposure ends and when symptoms begin, right? For example, some people, their exposure ends and sometimes symptoms don't develop until much later in life. And that's a pretty common scenario, but it's not an exclusive scenario, right? We also see the symptom people are symptomatic during exposure or right after exposure, but it becomes really challenging at that point to say what's the cause there, because when you're actively being exposed to these head impacts, having concussions, what's from concussion, is there's what, and then what's from something else. So it's really hard to say when the exposure and the symptoms are so closely together. But historically, and even in our TES criteria, actually one of the features is called a delayed onset, meaning there's a delay of onset of symptoms from when the exposure ends.
Oh, very helpful. And we are seeing some questions. We have a very, in tune audience about maybe some of these comorbid
Yeah.
either diseases or syndromes that are co-occurring. A specific question about Parkinson's or Parkinsonian features comorbid with CTE or suspected CTE. So could you also touch on, what we see both from a pathology standpoint, but also from a clinical standpoint?
Yeah, what we're increasingly seeing is that, we have this one path we've studied a lot, exposure to repetitive head impacts and risk for CTE. But we also are seeing another path where this exposure to repetitive head impacts might influence someone's risk for other types of pathologies, things like the pathologies related to Parkinson, things like injury to the white matter or vascular injury, and all of these pathologies can also contribute to people's symptoms. So we're certainly seeing, and this is true for the field of neurodegenerative disease in general, right? It's very rare that these occur in isolation. They are often co-occurring together. And we see, in terms of kind of the question about Parkinsonism, it's classically been described in the setting of boxers, right? I think we're most used to seeing that as a symptom of people who've had a lot of head trauma from boxing. We have hypothesized that, maybe there's different phenotypes or symptoms by the different types of head trauma, because we often don't see that Parkinsonism as an initial feature in people who played American football, for example, tends to perhaps develop later on in the course. But we have also shown a relationship between, playing football and risk for Parkinson's as well. So the point is, it can result in a lot of different pathologies that all can contribute to some of these symptoms.
That's great, thank you. And we are seeing interest in the chat and in the question box about participating in research. So maybe we could hear from both of you about that process. So Mike, really starting with what that looks like, and maybe how we work together as an organization, CLF and BU, to recruit for research. I know there's specifically interest in getting some of those, fancy scans that you were showing us earlier. So maybe walking through that, and then Chris following up with kind of the thesis behind the research registry and why it's an important way to keep people involved in what's going on.
Yeah, absolutely. So from the beginning, we've obviously partnered so closely with Concussion Legacy Foundation, and one of the reasons we do is for our human subject studies. So people who come in to participate and do our research studies. And in terms of what we have several different types of studies going on. We have the studies where we call it the HOPE study. This is at the core of our Alzheimer's disease research and CTE Center. This is where we follow people longitudinally. So we do annual evaluations on people. It's closely integrated with our clinic, our memory and aging clinic as well. And so this is really a great venue for getting kind of a really rich kind of evaluation. I would say we can throw the link to the study perhaps in the chat box here, and then also to get involved, I think Concussion Legacy Foundation can also help with that connection as well. We're getting involved we're soon in March or April, we're going to launch a new study where we're going to look at blood biomarkers, and I think that's also targeting people who are on the brain donation registry through Concussion Legacy Foundation. So I'm sure you'll be hearing from us about that too. But yeah, we have several studies. We're happy to share these links to get you involved in one of them.
Yeah, and I would say, I thank you to the more than 11,000 people who are part of our research registry. I mean, it did begin as a brain donation registry because there was no clinical research, but now it's a dual registry. And basically the idea is, if you are concerned about this, if you care about this, sign up for the registry and be part of these studies that help answer all these incredible questions that we don't yet have answers for. It really is going to come out of people volunteering their time because they're worried about themselves. They've seen a family member affected, maybe the people they grew up idolizing on TV, they know are struggling. But it takes those volunteers. So if you sign up for the research registry, which I know is in the chat and we followed up with, you will then be invited to research studies as they come up. And I'm sure you will qualify for one at some point, and your volunteering for that study will mean everything for figuring this thing out. So I've been a guinea pig for some studies. I'll continue to do it, and I would hope you join me, because we're already getting answers, and we're going to get better answers going forward.
Definitely. And I do see, more questions about treatment down the line. And this is really how we can contribute to working towards a treatment that can reverse or, modify this disease. And it really is through this research we need to keep going. So really, we cannot do it without your participation. And that's why we're really passionate about the research registry and the work that we do with Boston University. I know we have been here a while. I'm going to pick two more questions, one for each of you. Mike, we did get a couple in last minute, one from Janice, who joined us last week on our webinar. So Janice, thank you so much for sharing your story. And she's asking, about tau and its role following, a single concussion, or does it take multiple impacts for that to develop and, progress? And similarly, Margaret's asking, can you completely recover from a singular concussion? So I do feel like they're questions we can answer in the same vein.
Yeah, I think these are really important questions and something we provide a lot of education on to our research participants and in our clinic too. CTE, we think it, or we know, is from repetitive head impacts. And these are thousands of repetitive head impacts over the course of someone's lifetime. So we're not talking about one concussion or two concussions, right? The data actually shows that most people recover from concussions. Again, there are people who have prolonged symptoms that can go years out. But we're really not talking about one, two, or three events here. We're talking about a lifetime of hitting your head through things like American football or other sources, and that's what we think is triggering this progressive brain disease.
Great, thank you, Mike. And Chris, I think a good way to close out this segment, we've had a question about, what other organizations are working on this research, and we're very fortunate now that it is a global effort. So if you could touch briefly, on the Global Brain Bank and why that is a really important initiative that we've been, spearheading at CLF to connect our teams, in Boston with our teams in Australia. And we will close the Q&A with that.
Great. Yeah, and just to note, domestically, BU is collaborating with now over a dozen universities on various projects, and there's a lot of clinical research centers working on this. So if you do want to find a doctor, do reach out on that. Regarding the international efforts, part of our vision is that we are excited that this became an issue in the U.S. first, but we won't solve it as fast unless we have the rest of the world working with us. And there's a lot of great scientists around the world. What's been holding them back is the fact that there aren't the cases to talk about. And this sort of started when the NFL started importing some international people, or some from Australia, who used to say, we don't have this problem in Australia, therefore it must not be real. And so I wouldn't call it. I made a strategic choice to start a brain bank in Australia with Dr. Michael Buckland. And he has done an amazing job now finding the first few dozen cases of CTE in Australian athletes, and the first in rugby league and Australian rules football. And that model really works well towards building a research enterprise. I know we have a bunch of friends from Australia here today, so thank you guys for your support of CLF Australia, which we started less than 2 years ago to support that brain bank, the Australian Sports Brain Bank. So we've done this in Australia. We've now partnered with the University of Toronto, thanks to Dr. Bureau's connections. We started a brain bank in partnership with Oxford University in the UK. We've been collaborating with the University of Sao Paulo in Brazil on some very interesting studies. We've partnered with the University of Auckland and Sir Richard Fallon and a great team of scientists there. So we're basically trying to get countries with great medical infrastructure working on this by helping them find those first cases and then helping coordinate them with the great teams at BU and everywhere else, so that we have really a global effort to solve this problem. So we're very excited the model has worked. In Australia, the conversation on CTE is as loud as it was here 10 years ago. And we hope that that international collaboration continues. And we look forward to facilitating it. And that's a lot of what Dr. Bureau does.
Yeah, it's great to see the conversation and just the growth of this space. And with that, Dr. Alosco, really is such a great pleasure to work alongside you and get to spend such a great amount of time together working on these studies. Thank you again for joining us. It's always a pleasure, as you can see with the enormous amount of questions in the chat and the Q&A that we did not get to, that you are a popular guy. So thank you for being here. To follow the latest research updates for everyone who's here, we'll put the links to all the social media platforms for the BU CTE Center so that you can follow along. Again, sign up for the research registry if you are interested in potentially signing up for any of the studies that we will roll out. And again, you will be the first to know as those studies become available. So Mike, thank you for joining us during this International CTE Awareness Month.
Thanks for having me. I always enjoy being here. If I can be of anyone help to anyone out there, I'm here and available.
Thanks,
Great.
Dr. Alosco. You're the man.
Yeah. All right. Bye, everyone.
All right, and moving more into our military discussion here, more specifically, so much of the early research on CTE, as we've talked about, is really centered on contact and collision sports, specifically former American football players. But again, as you know, Dr. Nowinski was mentioning, with all the national news stories in the recent months and around the world, you know, especially in Australia, we're seeing a loud media push. There is, you know, increasing awareness of CTE in other sports. And then here in the US, if any of you have been, you know, following the news, there's been a lot more awareness about the long-term consequences of brain trauma in military communities. So Dr. Nowinski, if you could just take a few minutes to share what CLF is doing to support service members, you know, both active and veteran communities through our clinical and brain-brain research, that would be great.
Be happy to. I'm going to go real fast though, because what's exciting here is to hear from Charlie Bailey, newest member of our team and you know, real American hero. But I'll show you just the background of what we've been working on, what he's now leading for us. Is that we know that TBI is a problem in the military. We know PTSD is. CT's been understudied. We just haven't really worked on it. We know it's there. We know it's there certainly in ex-athletes who've served. We now know it's there in those who have served with and didn't play sports, but just got service-induced TBI, repetitive head impacts, but we don't know a lot about it. And so we're trying to accelerate that. And so what we are doing is we're trying to encourage brain donation, specifically from veterans, through Project Enlist. We really want to serve as this catalyst, just like we have in other countries in the US with specific veteran cases, and get more attention on this so that more resources are driven towards those suffering and more energy behind developing treatments. And so we're trying to create a culture of brain donation in the military. We've had great success since we've started, but there's 20 million veterans out there, and we're still, you know, getting a lot more athlete brains than we do veteran brains. So we haven't really penetrated that yet. So we have a lot of great partner organizations that work with us on this. You know, we were just talking to the DAV, who's been a tremendous partner. We were just catching up with the Robert Irvine Foundation, another great partner, Team Red, White, and Blue. You know, so we're to continue to build partnerships with groups for education awareness and supporting the research. Great Veteran Advisory Board. You can find them on our website and learn more about them. But really, it's how do we mirror this success we've had in sports and do it with the military? And interestingly, you know, that last image was about the announcement of the first national PTSD brain bank, which wasn't even started until 2014. Dr. McKee is a leader in that, who's a leader of the Unite Brain Bank. So there's a lot of great crossover in terms of the scientists working on this through our Boston and VA connections. And so I just encourage we have some great stories on our website at projectenlist.org if you want to learn about this. But please do join, sign up to donate your brain. You know, if you lose someone, yeah, unfortunately, always potentially reach out to us. It's always a hard thing to raise. But this problem is very real, and it doesn't get enough attention. And so, yeah, people like Robert Allardyce there. I see Elizabeth's here. She's one of our first West Point graduates with CTE, who's a great football player. He's got a wonderful family that carries his legacy on. So I will close that, and I'll leave it. Samantha, am I introducing Charlie or are you? Didn't read that
I can introduce Charlie. So thank
Please
you.
do.
Yeah, thank you, Chris, for being here and giving us that overview and, you know, all that you do for CLF. We would not run without you, and we certainly would not run around the world. So big shout out to Chris. He's really the reason we are all here. But with that, really excited to bring on our next guest, Charlie Bailey, who's a recent team member addition to CLF, but he has been involved with us for quite some time. So we will learn more about that. But Charlie Bailey is a retired U.S. Army Infantry and Military Intelligence Officer who's been a member of the CLF Veteran Advisory Board since 2020, so about 4 years now. And then late last year, Charlie joined our team in a full-time capacity as the Director of Development and Military Programs. He is joining us today from Mesa, Arizona, just outside of Scottsdale. Charlie, thank you so much for joining us and joining the CLF team. We are so fortunate to have you.
Thank you, Sam. Very, very excited to be here. I appreciate the opportunity. If you want, I'll jump right in and kind of take it from there.
Yeah, let's do it. Yeah, let's hear about, before we get into your Army experience, let's talk about why you got involved with CLF in general.
Yeah, so absolutely. My, first of all, I spent over 17 years in the Army. First part of that was as an infantry officer that included a combat deployment to Mosul, Iraq in 2005, 2006. On the tail end of that deployment, I was wounded in a suicide vehicle IED attack that resulted in a traumatic brain injury and the loss of my left eye. I was very fortunate as I was, medevaced back to Walter Reed and the Army Medical Center, Walter Reed Army Medical Center at that time. I was very fortunate to meet actually a member of our CLF's Veteran Advisory Board, gentleman named Major General Spider Marks, who leveraged his personal network on my behalf so I could continue to serve. So I could no longer serve in the infantry, but I was allowed to transfer into military intelligence, where I served for another 10 years, to include another combat deployment. But it was Spider years later that ultimately introduced me to Dr. Nowinski. That's what ultimately brought me to the Concussion Legacy Foundation, where, like you mentioned, I've served on the Veteran Advisory Board for the last 3 or 4 years, and then more recently have gotten sort of reconnected to a number of the folks that I served with back in 2005, 2006. And quite frankly, I was, I'll just say, beyond disturbed by what I've seen has come of many of their lives since that deployment. And knowing what we went through together during that deployment, I have no doubt in my mind that many of them are suffering, in all likelihood, suffering from a potential CTE. And so that's sort of what kind of compelled me to move in this direction in a full-time capacity. And obviously Chris and I were connected, and I was blessed that he offered me the opportunity to join the team in a full-time capacity. And so late last year, I stepped in as the Director of Development and Military Programs. So here I am.
Yeah, and we are, again, so lucky, and really building off of some of the bits you shared in that answer about, some of those discussions you were having with people and the things you were seeing, from your experience and, those conversations you are having. What is the general attitude about brain injury, and have you seen it change at all? Not really move? Like, what has that experience been like for you?
Yeah, great question. To be honest with you, back then, right, and in many ways, this is still the case, it was rarely discussed. We have to sort of keep in mind that while you're a professional war fighter, and with that comes a warrior mindset that often prevents people from, admitting they have been or may be injured. Admittedly, I would put myself right in that category. It was not until 2016 when I started having seizures that were related to the injuries I sustained 10 years prior in 2005, 2006. It wasn't until then that I actually began to accept that, I myself wasn't invincible. And that mindset really extends to a warrior culture that every unit, especially those in special operations and combat arms units, they're trying to build that culture. And while there's a need to educate the military community and help them understand how acceptance and treatment can actually improve the readiness of your force, it's inherently easier to simply ignore the issue at both the individual and collective levels. And so I will say, in terms of how it's changed, the attitude in the military has changed to some degree since, my first deployment, at least in terms of, in terms of how we treat those who've been exposed to a blast in combat. But the blast that took me out of the fight in Iraq was one of many IEDs that my platoon was hit by throughout the course of that deployment. And at that point in time, there was no protocol, right? There were many times that a vehicle would be hit. Multiple people, if not everyone in that vehicle, would be knocked out. We would simply come to, check one another to ensure they were okay, and then just kind of continue mission. Frankly, we would. This sounds horrible saying it now, but we would joke that we shook off IEDs like linebackers shake off hits in football. It became almost a point of pride, and we developed a sense of invincibility. Fast forward to my deployment in 2011-12 in Afghanistan, 5 years later, if you were even close to an IED at that point, you were at least put through a concussion protocol similar to what we see like in football. And if you didn't pass, you were pulled out of the fight for several days. Still not ideal by any stretch of the imagination, but certainly an improvement from where we were, 5 years prior. So it's moved in the right direction. However, I would be inclined to suggest we can definitely improve the protocol immediately following an exposure, and a lot more can be done to track exposures over time to ensure we're frankly, that we aren't risking the most important weapon we have in our arsenal, which is the soldiers, Marines, sailors, and airmen that actually, defend this country.
Yeah, of course. And I mean, that was a really thorough and great insight into what those internal conversations looks like and the internal structure. And now switching gears to talk more about, I guess, that external narrative and, CTE research, all these things that are ongoing. And, today we're very fortunate to have, more than 1,000 military veterans who've pledged their brains to CTE research, but comparing them to the number of former athletes who've pledged and are, undergoing research studies, it's still a relatively, understudied population. So as our director of military programs, how are you approaching this conversation with fellow veterans about getting involved in clinical research, pledging their brain? What is your message to someone who may be apprehensive about going through this process?
Yeah, great question. I think first, I think it's really important to understand that most of this community, service is simply part of their DNA, right? So I typically frame it up through that lens, right? That we have to help people understand that to prevent what has happened or is happening to so many of us, we need those who've served to donate their brains to drive the research on behalf of our brothers and sisters that will follow us going forward. Additionally, we have to understand, how a career in the military and associated blast exposures impact people over time. That has to be studied. We have to have the research. So, most of the men that I served with in Iraq departed the military after that deployment. Very few of them had a specific event, like myself, that took me out of the fight and led to a diagnosis, of traumatic brain injury. However, all of them were exposed to dozens of blasts throughout the course of that deployment. And subsequently, unfortunately, many of their lives have sort of unraveled over time as the symptoms that are very much in line with what we see in CTE have started to manifest. So I try to encourage them and explain to them that not only does CLF, have the ability to help them get the treatment that they need now, but we need to understand what has happened, in our post-deployment lives and how their symptoms have presented, so we can get closer to an understanding exactly how blast exposure in the military has affected them over time, and ultimately help us get to a place where we can diagnose it in the living.
Yeah, certainly. And I mean, we know, and you've touched on this, that there are unfortunately so many people in the military community who are currently suffering from the impacts of brain injury or suspected CTE. And I'm seeing in the chat, notes about training. I know you and I have had this discussion where there is a huge burden in training. We're seeing this with our partners around the world who are working on military programs. But with that in mind, and those people who are currently suffering, this is an area that you and I work closely on with our patient services team. But maybe just give us a peek under the hood of some of the resources that we offer for that community here at CLF, what our vision is moving forward as we look to really expand our work with Project Enlist, Operation Brain Health, all of the above.
Yeah, excellent. Yeah, I mean, honestly, I have to, I think it's worth stating outright that the CLF website, projectenlist.org, our newsletters and social media are, first and foremost. But also have to highlight Operation Brain Health, which is located within the that projectenlist.org website. Library of resources designed to help veterans and caregivers who live with CTE or other effects of brain trauma. Great videos on strategies for improving daily life, tips for medical care. Honestly, and this sort of makes sense, right? The CLF and BU have been doing this for over 15 years. There's no one out there that has been more closely connected to the issue, and there's no more convenient resource to find the information that people are seeking, whether it's related to the research, to signs or symptoms, or for or simply asking for help. And in my opinion, the military community is about it's 10 to 15 years behind the athlete community in terms of just awareness around CTE, and that that is part of the reason that the military is an understudied population at this point. But I do believe that's changing. We're starting to recognize that this really is an issue, and if people have a history of blast exposure, they're now beginning to wonder and explore whether their issues are a product of CTE. And I think the other piece that we've done a great job with is really creating tools for caregivers, encouraging caregivers to reach out to CLF as well. I mean, it kind of goes back to that military mindset. It's oftentimes the caregiver, the family, that recognizes those symptoms and those issues. And so, just like I think we've seen in the athlete community, oftentimes it's that caregiver who's reaching out on behalf of their loved one to explore the potential issue here, and potential treatment options as well before the service member or the veteran actually is ready to take that step. And so it really is CLF really is the best option out there for both those who have served and as we know, military service, just like just like CTE, it's a family affair, and so it really is a great way for both those who have served and caregivers to reach out and get the information that they need.
Well, thank you, Charlie, so much for being here and sharing your perspective, and just updating our viewers on what we're doing and what you envision for CLF in this role specifically. Again, I probably sound like a broken record, but again, so proud and lucky to have you on our team, and really excited to continue to work with you and the rest of the CLF team on advancing this issue and hopefully finding solutions for our families. Again, in the chat, you will find the Project Enlist website. It's something that we've redone recently, and we hope you enjoy it. Would love to have you share that with veterans in your lives or anyone that you may know who'd be interested. That link again is in the chat. I'd like to take a chance to thank all of our guests for being here today to discuss what's new and what's next in CTE research. We do hope that you're leaving here with a greater understanding of not only how this research takes place, but also where it's heading over the next few years and the role that you can certainly play in helping us do that. Again, we've talked about this a few times. tonight, but I do feel like it's worth repeating. If you or someone you love is currently struggling with symptoms of suspected CTE, we are here for you. We would really like to help you. Please reach out to the CLF helpline. The URL is here on your screen and in the chat. And our team would, love to be able to offer you whatever we can to support. Beyond connecting you to medical providers and providing, education resources like Chris mentioned, our patient services team also hosts regular meetings with a variety of CT-focused support groups. So those are all on Zoom. You can join them from anywhere. So we do encourage those interested to select that option. But if you would like a more personalized, encouragement and approach, we do have a one-on-one peer support connection program where you can, really build that relationship with another person. So we will put the link to those resources in the chat for you, and we'd love to help you make those connections. We also developed a CTE caregiver guidebook. I know Charlie touched on, CTE being a family affair, and we believe that firmly here, and we really want to support our caregivers. So that is also in the chat, where it's just a collection of the resources from our website in a condensed place where you can, use it to help your loved ones. Also beneficial for patients. So if you are struggling and you just like access to it, definitely not exclusively for caregivers. It's certainly valuable for anyone, but we did make it with a caregiver in mind. Finally, we are able to put on events like this for free through your support. If you found this event helpful and want to pay it forward by making a donation to CLF of any amount, it will help us continue to offer these sorts of resources for our community. There is a donate link in the chat. But with that, I would like to thank you for joining us. We do hope to see you at our next webinar, CTE in Women, next week. And wherever you're following along during International CTE Awareness Month, have a great day or night. Thank you.